Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. In today's presentation, we're going to take a look at American Romanticism Part 2. And in this case, we're going to look a little bit more specifically about this term, Romanticism, and the different ways that it actually divided within this particular movement. Now, just a review from the previous video, remember Romanticism doesn't have anything to do with what we think of as romantic love. Even though we hear that word romance, it really isn't the kind of literature that we're going to be studying. So in part one, we looked at some of the history of how Romanticism got started. Remember, it was this response to the neoclassicism and this real idea of logic and structure. In Romanticism, we saw imagination over reason, the value of nature over technology, and this idea of a personal individual experience being more important than collective or classic wisdom of the ages. So the Romantics believed that the natural universe was this mysterious world all of its own, and that this idea of remoteness of time and place could give you that sense of imagination. So you'll see a lot of the Romantic stories actually have a setting that's deep in the past, that kind of long ago and far away, once upon a time kind of feeling to them. And a lot of them are sort of inspired by the ancient British Druids and medieval knights. You'll see the sense of chivalry kind of coming back in, and the idea of the tragedy of young girls in difficult situations, or dying young even, and having to be rescued or being unable to be rescued. And you'll see a lot of that in some of these stories. Now, in part one, we talked again about this idea of Romanticism being a response to neoclassicism. But there are a few other things in the United States in particular that influenced the development. One was this idea of the developing frontier in the 1800s, this idea that this limitless amount of expanse. Lewis and Clark had come back from the expedition. We had all of these new westward expansion going on. So this idea that there was this unlimited geography. This idea of optimism again, and greater than what we see in some of the European countries, because again, the sense that we were this brand new country and we had this frontier to explore. And the idea of experimentation in both science and institutions, that we had all of these immigration coming in, so you had these new perspectives and mingling, and to some extent the growth of industrialization. You start to see the seeds of this divide between the North and the South, where the North becomes more and more industrialized and the South remained quite dependent on agriculture. Now, it's impossible to talk about Romanticism without talking about the world of nature. But for the Romantic style, we really divide nature into two parts. That is the natural world, where you'd see the organic kind of stuff you can taste and touch, and the supernatural, or the things that are above and beyond the individual things that you can actually experience. So on the nature side, with this idea of organic, things that develop on their own, that nature is life-giving and life-sustaining, that there's this heightened degree of individuality. No two snowflakes are alike, no two trees are exactly alike, that it's experiential. You don't read about nature in a book, you go out and live it yourself. That even the smallest, most ordinary things could contain great truth and beauty, and that there was this universal quality to nature that belonged to all of mankind. And you start to see in the Romantics, and particularly in the Transcendentalists, which we'll talk about in a minute, the beginning of the idea of social morality. Because if you're going to begin that all universe is accessible to all individuals and that each person's experience is unique, how do you then justify something like slavery? So you see, Romanticism actually led to some of the social activist movements that also came out of the 19th century. Now, the supernatural side of the Romantics was actually divided into two parts. There's the godly part, which deals with the idea of the spirit. And here you'll see reference in the stories to things like the angels, this focus on your soul, idea of heaven versus hell, the nature of sin and the grace of salvation, the importance of prayer, and of mankind developing a personal relationship with God, not going through the structure of a church, for example. And then on the other side of the supernatural, you have the Gothics. And this is why someone like Edgar Allan Poe, who most of us associate with kind of horror stories and Halloween type things, is considered a romantic author. If you don't understand the term romanticism, you don't see that. But the dark romantics were sometimes known as the Gothics. And in these kinds of stories, you'll see a lot of emphasis on things like ghosts, demons, death and hauntings, hell and punishment, and the monster kind of side of things. So you have that natural side and then that supernatural side, and within the supernatural side it gets divided into kind of the religious spiritual side and then the dark Gothic side. And then you throw into the mix the Transcendentalists. Now, the Transcendentalists were a very specific form of American Romanticism that kind of bridged this divide between this idea of the Gothic and the natural world. Now, one way to get an idea of what the Transcendentalists began is if you looked at the Puritan world. So when we looked at the Crucible, for example, you have this idea that the nature of mankind is sinful. We are born sinful, and we have this fall, and we have to atone for the sins of our forefathers, particularly Adam. Then during the Enlightenment, or the Neoclassics period, you had this idea that everyone's born a blank slate, what was known as the tabula rasa kind of idea, that you are what your environment is, and that anyone can be formed or taught or treated or shaped in a certain way. The Transcendentalists, on the other hand, believed that everyone was born good, that there was this innate goodness in nature that we were all gifted with, and that every person had this kernel of good within them. Now, along with this idea of nature and godliness came the concept of the oversoul. And these transcendentalist writers had almost religious feelings towards nature, like nature became God personified. They saw this direct connection between the general large scope of the entire universe and the tiny, minute individual human soul. And this idea that divinity was in everything, that you could learn about God and learn about the spirits and learn about your own true nature and your soul through a flower or through a tree or through a cloud as much as you could in a church or in a particular book. That this divinity permeated all objects, whether they were alive or not. And that the whole purpose of human life was this union with the oversoul. And the oversoul was this larger thing that connected us through instinct, that all the world was actually one. This idea of the merging of the individual person with God and nature to create this sense of this overarching connectivity of life. So to review or connect these a little bit, some of the transcendental beliefs, remember transcendentalism is a subset of Romanticism, was that intuition was the highest human faculty. It's not what you could learn, but it's what you could experience and know. They kind of rejected the materialism and the technology that you saw building up after the Industrial Revolution. The idea of simplicity was the path to spiritual greatness. How many times, particularly during this season as we come into December, you're going to hear people talking about the simple joys, and it's not about the materialism, it's not about what's under the tree or what you're giving to each other or what you're getting. It's about that idea of connection, that simplicity. And that the way that you got your truth and inspiration was to go out into the natural world and experience yourself. So the sense of nonconformity, individuality, and self-reliance, that your own ideas and experiences were just as valid as anything that was written down in those old men's history books.